Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into the shadowy marble corridors of ancient Rome, a world where sandals slapped against blood-streaked floors and justice was, let's say, creatively interpreted. You're not just lying in bed tonight. Nope. You're gently drifting through misty forums where whispers of bizarre punishments float through the air, lingering like sandalwood smoke after an awkward Senate debate. You're wrapped in a toga of confusion, because what you're about to hear will make modern law look like a pillow fight. You might think ancient punishments were all lions and swords, but oh no, Rome was far more imaginative than that. From sewers to torches to being gently coaxed into a barrel of snakes. Okay, maybe not so gently. You're about to discover why being a wrongdoer in ancient Rome was a risky career move. And honestly, you probably wouldn't survive this as a time traveler unless your crimes included being extremely boring. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in the late Republic era. The streets are emptying for curfew. The air is warm, thick with the scent of olive oil and something faintly fishy. Likely garum, that fermented condiment the Romans adored, and your nose wishes they didn't. Torches flicker across the marble walls as you step past graffiti praising a gladiator named Caius the Gallbladder. Yes, that's his real nickname. He was famous for rupturing internal organs with minimal enthusiasm. Whispers follow you. Not the kind from gossipy matrons, but the soft ones. Guards grumbling about punishments too ridiculous to be real. One mentions a senator made to parade around naked, painted in gold, for misappropriating grain rations. Another talks of a man sewn into a sack with a dog, a monkey, a rooster, and a snake. The animals were not told to play nice. You pause beneath a colonnade as a few drunk patricians stumble by. One hiccups a joke about the Emperor Caligula, who once declared war on Neptune, god of the sea. To prove his victory, he ordered soldiers to collect seashells as spoils of war. The punishment for laughing at that decree? Public flogging, no joke. Historians still argue whether Caligula's seashell campaign was real or the product of ancient gossip, but the punishments that followed were all too real. You wander into a small court building. Inside, a trial is wrapping up. The accused? A shopkeeper who sold watered-down wine. His sentence? A night locked in a cage with wild dogs who were hopefully fed beforehand. Maybe. A magistrate nearby tells a tale of the infamous parricide punishment. You lean closer, captivated. If you killed your father in ancient Rome, you weren't just executed. No, you were sewn into a leather sack, alive, along with a dog, a monkey, a rooster, and a snake, then tossed into a river. Each animal was symbolic, though scholars can't agree on why. The rooster might represent betrayal, the monkey, chaos. Or maybe the Romans just grabbed whatever was squawking nearby. Honestly, monkey availability may have influenced Roman justice more than philosophy. You sit by a fountain. A woman in simple stola robes tells you a hushed story. Her cousin was once sentenced to exile for sneezing during an augur's reading. The omens were clear. Jupiter was annoyed. Exile wasn't always a bad gig. Sometimes it meant retiring to the countryside with a vineyard, unless, of course, you were exiled to a swamp, in which case, bring boots and fear. There's a tired old scribe scribbling punishments into wax tablets beside you. He mutters about the Lex Cornelia, one of Rome's earliest laws against violence and poisoning. It was intended to protect citizens, but quickly expanded into an umbrella law under which you could be punished for vaguely looking suspicious. Or, as one praetor put it, casting bad vibes. The punishment? Confiscation of property, branding, or, if the mood struck the judge, being forced to recite all of Cicero's speeches backwards. Okay, that last one might be exaggerated, but branding on the forehead with F for fugitivus, runaway, was very real. You drift deeper into the city. The moon now glints off bronze statues and gladius blades. A soldier by the wall is being scolded, not for dereliction of duty, but for wearing mismatched sandals. His punishment? 3 nights on latrine duty and no wine rations. In Roman terms, that's borderline medieval. The city's eerie silence wraps around you like a woolen cloak. You realize Roman law wasn't about fairness, it was about order, and maybe a little bit of dramatic flair, like punishing a gossiping noblewoman by making her walk through the forum carrying a live goose. For symbolism, of course. Or maybe someone just had a goose surplus that day. You start to feel drowsy, lulled by the rhythm of sandals on stone and the soft, echoing hum of Latin prayers. The more you learn, the stranger this civilization becomes. And yet, you know, this is just the beginning. You're still in the shadows of Rome, the hush of night curling around the city like incense smoke in a shrine. Your feet follow the faint scent of charred herbs and stone dust, until you find yourself drifting near the sacred house of the Vestals. There's a stillness here, almost reverent, almost suspicious. The Vestal virgins, Rome's most revered priestesses, lived in that marble sanctuary for 30 years, sworn to chastity and duty. They weren't just temple guardians. They were the metaphysical glue holding the empire together. If a Vestal broke her vow of virginity, Rome believed it wasn't just bad, it was cosmically dangerous, like dropping your iPhone in lava and still expecting to check your texts afterward. So, what did Rome do when a Vestal slipped up? They buried her alive. No crowd, no spectacle, just a slow, ceremonial descent into a small underground room, equipped with a couch, a lamp, some bread, and water. Because even in punishment, Romans loved formality. They couldn't kill a Vestal outright. That would offend the gods. So they left her in a technically not murder scenario and walked away. Because logic. You edge closer to the temple courtyard. A low conversation between 2 senators catches your ear. She had a lover, some noble's son, one mutters. They found them hiding near the Tiber. Foolish, the other sighs, not about the betrayal, but about being caught. Could have at least bribed the augur. You hear the details. The accused Vestal had served for over a decade. When confronted, she didn't deny it, just asked for a moment to pray. No screaming, no escape. She was led to the field of Mars, placed inside a tomb with smooth stone walls and sealed beneath layers of earth while the crowd turned away. It was Rome's version of closing the tab quietly. Historians still argue whether this method was about divine law or political theater. After all, some of these accusations were suspiciously well-timed, especially during power struggles in the Senate. The odd part? Her lover didn't get buried. No, he got the whipping to death special, often administered publicly with a bundle of rods tied with red cord, called the fasces. The same bundle that later inspired Mussolini, proving once again that history never quite leaves quietly. You sit near a column and glance up at a mural. It shows a Vestal carrying fire, symbol of eternal Rome. And yet, the irony isn't lost on you. A civilization that feared chaos so much, it punished passion with entombment. A patrol walks by, their sandals echoing like a metronome for your nerves. One guard tells a story of another punishment. A Vestal suspected of impurity but acquitted. To cleanse suspicion, she was forced to walk barefoot across smoldering ash. When her souls didn't burn, the crowd gasped. Divine innocence? Or clever calluses? You think of how bizarre it is. These women were expected to stay pure for 3 decades in a city that barely made it through dinner without scandal. Yet, when they did break the vow, the judgment was swift and strangely poetic. A sleepy historian beside you opens a scroll pointing to a passage. During Emperor Domitian's reign, 3 Vestals were executed within 1 year. Coincidence? Or was the emperor just having a stressful quarter? Some whispered that he invented the accusations to silence dissent. After all, if you can accuse the holiest of women of betrayal, everyone else falls in line pretty fast. Plus, it's hard to organize a rebellion when you're busy digging ceremonial graves. You follow the echo of sandals down a quieter road. The moonlight catches on the Temple of Vesta, where the sacred flame flickers, never allowed to go out. If it did, the Romans believed it would signal disaster. Earthquakes, invasions, economic downturns, basically a Roman version of Mercury in retrograde. If the flame died on a Vestal's watch, punishment wasn't just likely, it was mandatory. One scroll tells of a Vestal who tripped while lighting the flame. The high priest claimed it was an omen and confined her to silence for an entire season. Try going 3 months without gossip in ancient Rome. That's the real punishment. Another tale, unverified but frequently whispered, suggests that one especially unlucky Vestal was framed. Her rivals wanted her gone, and since Romans loved a good scandal, it took just one shadowy rumor. She was entombed within a week. The surviving Vestals ordered to keep smiling, which is emotionally complex. As you sit now on a stone bench warmed by centuries of sun and secrets, you wonder, was this justice or performance? Rome, after all, was obsessed with appearances. Honor mattered, ritual mattered, and punishing a woman so publicly, so dramatically, without bloodshed, was the ultimate reminder that even sacred fire was subject to Roman control. And yet, you sense something else in the air. Maybe it's just the scent of old incense, or maybe it's the faint sob of someone who never got to finish her prayer. You close your eyes, the hum of the city now, a lullaby of sandals, whispers, and the slow heartbeat of ancient stone. You shift slightly on the stone bench, lulled by the distant murmur of the Tiber and the occasional shuffle of toga hems. Around you, the city dozes under the warm hush of midnight, but power never sleeps in Rome. And where power gathers, especially the senatorial kind, petty drama and bizarre punishments are never far behind. You wander now into the Senate House, the Curia Julia, still faintly reeking of sandalwood, ego, and a pinch of old sweat. The floor mosaics glint under torchlight, reflecting the same smugness carved into every bust of a Roman statesman. This is where orators battled with words, daggers, and, occasionally, public humiliation. The Senate wasn't a courtroom per se, but they knew how to punish one of their own with exquisite flair. Like the case of Senator Fabius Maximus, who misused public funds for a private bathhouse. Instead of prison, he was sentenced to appear at the next Senate session in a slave's tunic and sit on a chamber pot turned upside down. Dignity? Expired. Legacy? Flushed. You step closer to a marble plinth where a whispered tour begins. The guide, an exhausted praetor on night duty, lists a few infamous senatorial shame tactics. One particularly delicious favorite, the Clapius Infamis. A bronze disc hung around the neck of the disgraced, inscribed with their crimes in elegant cursive, like wearable shame. Imagine being canceled by ancient Etsy. One senator, accused of bribery during grain shortages, had to wear such a disc while standing in the forum for 3 consecutive market days. Passers-by were encouraged to mock him. Some wrote limericks. One teenager supposedly threw a turnip. And that's the historical moment when vegetables became political. Historians still argue whether such punishments were legally binding or just improvised rituals of humiliation. The line between official decree and vengeful trolling was thin in Rome, especially when wine flowed and tempers frayed. You lean against a column, watching a reenactment unfold. Yes, the Romans invented the courtroom drama genre long before HBO. In this performance, a senator falsely accuses a rival of impiety. When the claim is debunked, the accuser must perform penance, scrubbing the Senate floor with his own toga while reciting lines from Virgil in verse, backwards. And don't think this was an isolated case of toga-based justice. A real senator, Marcus Calpurnius Piso, was once forced to apologize publicly by balancing on one foot while wearing donkey ears. His crime? Mocking Caesar's handwriting during a council meeting. Revenge, like politics, was theatrical. You drift outside now, where 2 younger officials are exchanging gossip over mulled wine. "Did you hear about Gellius?" one asks, half laughing. They caught him napping during a sacred reading, had to carry a goat statue through the streets shouting, "I am a sleepy liar." Classic punishment, honestly. Rome never let an opportunity for overreaction pass, unpunished. There were even laws about tone of voice. Well, not formally, but tone mattered. Disrespecting a magistrate, especially one who'd just flubbed a public ritual, could lead to something called oribus verberari. Yes, being slapped on the ears. Repeatedly. By the very man you insulted. That's not metaphor. That's Tuesday in the Roman Republic. A night scholar nearby shares a favorite. During the year of the consulship of Lucullus, a junior senator tried to speed up proceedings by skipping the ceremonial reading of omens. His punishment? He had to sit in the forum dressed as Mercury and hand out scrolls for a day, declaring, "The gods are on a break." Saturn's worst temp job. The political punishment game wasn't only about shame, it was also strategy. By embarrassing a rival, you weakened their alliances, questioned their honor, and possibly stole their client base. It was the equivalent of stealing someone's Wi-Fi password and tweeting their browser history, only with more marble. You notice a small shrine to Pietas, the Roman virtue of duty. Next to it, a faint etching reads, "Let not pride in toga hide disgrace in soul." Poetic. Also possibly the earliest version of "Don't be a jerk in robes." Even emperors weren't immune to senatorial wrath, though few dared openly challenge them. Tacitus records that under Tiberius, senators walked a constant tightrope. One day you're applauded for loyalty. The next, you're accused of lèse-majesté and sentenced to exile on a wind-blasted island with no sandals and possibly aggressive sheep. You rest near the Senate steps now, eyes half closed. You've walked among politicians and penalties, through a system where power was reputation, and punishment could be as light as a slap or as heavy as social oblivion. You realize the true currency of Roman justice wasn't always blood, but embarrassment. A toga stained with shame was often worse than chains. And as the last of the torches dim, you wonder if any of these men slept easily, surrounded by whispers, scrolls, and the terrifying thought that tomorrow's punishment might just be another absurd invention waiting to happen. You stir as the city shifts around you. The politics of punishment give way to something more primal, more gladiatorial. You follow the low thunder of footsteps toward the edge of the city's heart, where the Ludus Magnus, Rome's most infamous gladiator school, looms like a stone skeleton under torchlight. Here, punishment comes with flair, and sometimes dental work. Inside, the scent is complex. Sweat, iron, oil, and a hint of overcooked barley. You find yourself in a narrow corridor lined with cells. Behind one barred door, a voice murmurs in rhythm. Prayers, maybe, or warm-up chants. In the shadows, you hear the scraping of metal on whetstones, a sound that could lull you to sleep or startle you upright, depending on how your day's been. Gladiators weren't just blood sport performers. They were also highly trained slaves who walked a razor-thin line between stardom and execution. And punishment? Oh, it wasn't just death. That would be too merciful. For those who disobeyed, cheated, or embarrassed their lanista, gladiator trainer, Rome had a range of consequences, many of them designed to be memorably miserable. One popular form of punishment? Boiling oil. Not on the whole body, mind you, but just the feet. The idea was to remind you who owned your souls without permanently ruining your stride. It was often accompanied by tooth pulling. Yes, really. Not because of cavities, but because a gladiator had insulted the cook's garum. The ancient Roman condiment wars were intense. You slip into a training chamber. The stone walls are grooved from years of missed swings and messy battles. In the center, two new recruits are sparring. One flinches, and the trainer, an ex-gladiator with one eye and an alarming laugh, snaps his fingers. "Hold the plank," he says, "for an hour." That's not metaphorical. They actually had to hold wooden planks over their heads as punishment for cowardice. If they dropped them, cue the whip. Historians still argue whether some of these accounts are exaggerated, especially the tale of a disobedient fighter who was forced to fight blindfolded against a baboon. Yes, a baboon. Records are sketchy, but graffiti near Pompeii reads, "Gaius bested the ape, but lost to a sneeze." There's another tale of a gladiator who faked injury to avoid a match. His punishment was creative. He was forced to fight in full armor, in a vat of olive oil. No traction, no balance, just slippery shame in front of 5,000 giggling Romans. Apparently, the audience loved it. Rome's first slapstick, but perhaps the strangest punishment involved teeth. Not losing them, but installing fake ones. One disgraced champion was punished by having golden teeth hammered in, permanently branding him a coward who smiled too brightly. Supposedly, the Emperor Claudius attended the next match and called him Aurum Jaw. The nickname stuck. The legacy did not. You walk the perimeter of the arena now, sand whispering beneath your feet. Another punishment involved forced silence. If a gladiator spoke out of turn or insulted the emperor, he'd be gagged for a week. Not with a simple cloth, of course, but with a ball of fig paste molded with hot pepper. That way, even if you chewed through it, the regret lingered. The lanista nearby, half asleep on a stool, points to a lineup of retired armor. One suit is notably smaller than the rest. "That was for kids," he mumbles. Once they punished a noble family by making their teenage son fight as a gladiator for a week. Didn't kill him, just bruised his ego enough to last a lifetime. Turns out, even nobles weren't safe from creative sentencing or concussions. You pass a fresco depicting a gladiator duel with exaggerated expressions. It's part comedy, part instruction. In the background, a trainer is seen holding a long stick with a fish tied to the end. The caption reads, "He who loses shall chase lunch." That's not an idiom. That was literally how some were punished, running laps around the arena while hungry, following a dangling fish on a string. Motivation comes in many forms. And then there's the ultimate humiliation. Reenactment, punishment. Some gladiators who dishonored themselves weren't executed but forced to act in mock plays, wearing costumes and reciting their failures to crowds. One scroll describes a once feared Murmillo who played Titus the Trembler in a comedy, complete with squeaky sandals and a chicken helmet. The audience laughed. He never fought again. You pause now in the empty arena, standing where thousands once screamed, cheered, and jeered. The silence is haunting, but somehow peaceful. In Rome, pain was spectacle, and punishment was often performed not just to correct, but to entertain. You lie back on a bench as the stars peek through the open roof above. You've seen cruelty today, yes, but also absurdity. And in the absurd, maybe there's comfort. Because let's face it, if your worst punishment is a YouTube comment, you're doing better than poor Aurum Jaw. The sun hasn't risen yet, but the city of Rome doesn't sleep. It simmers. And as you rise from your resting spot in the gladiator arena, your journey leads you somewhere far less glamorous. The underbelly of the city. Quite literally. You head toward the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's grand sewer system. Grand in function, at least. In smell, less so. The air grows thick as you approach, tinged with rot, moss, and something that could be either very old cheese or very recent tragedy. This was no mere plumbing system. The Cloaca Maxima, a marvel of early engineering, was built to drain the marshes and sewage from the city, helping turn Rome into a livable metropolis rather than a swampy fever dream. But it wasn't just waste that flowed through these stone arteries. Sometimes justice did too. You see, being thrown into the Cloaca Maxima wasn't just a rare freak punishment. It was a sanctioned form of execution and exile, a sort of out of sight, out of morality method for those deemed impure or inconvenient, especially if you'd offended the gods. Rome loved keeping its streets clean, both literally and spiritually. You stand by a heavy iron grate above the main drain. A soldier is recounting the tale of a moneylender accused of sacrilege. Instead of being executed in the forum, he was tied and lowered into the sewer, feet first. "Let the gods sort the sewage from the soul," the magistrate reportedly said. The quote has a ring to it, assuming you ignore the smell. Historians still argue whether these sewer punishments were commonplace or merely mythologized, but the sources are oddly specific. One scroll details a woman accused of necromancy being thrown into the cloaca with live toads tied to her wrists. Symbolic? Perhaps. Effective? Unclear? Dramatic? Absolutely. You descend now into the outer tunnels, safe from flooding, but not from the stories. In the shadows, a faded painting of a half-man, half-rat greets you. Probably not historical, but disturbing enough to keep trespassers away. Rome had ways of weaponizing urban legend. A former city cleaner once wrote that the worst punishment wasn't death in the cloaca, but surviving it. One convicted thief was dropped into the muck, left for dead, and resurfaced 3 days later in the Tiber, muttering prayers in reverse. The guards called it a miracle. The priests called it a problem. The man was promptly exiled to Sardinia, where the fish probably complained. There's another tale of a condemned priest who desecrated a temple. His sentence? To clean a stretch of sewer with only a spoon and a prayer for a year. He didn't make it past 2 weeks, but the story lived longer than his boots did. Of course, not every sewer-based punishment ended so bleakly. A favorite tavern tale tells of a rich merchant who bribed his way out of execution by pretending to be dead. He arranged for his body to be thrown into the cloaca. Once dropped, he slipped out of his bindings and waded to freedom through an exit pipe. The bad news? He emerged covered in filth during a high society banquet near the Tiber. The worst news? His mother-in-law was in attendance. She fainted. Twice. You make your way deeper into the tunnel system. Torchlight flickering against the damp walls. Bones? Possibly. Broken tiles and forgotten charms? Definitely. Some ancient graffiti reads, "If you're reading this, your life choices stink." Even Roman humor had its dad joke phase. The most disturbing punishment, perhaps, was symbolic. A traitor, name lost to time, was sentenced to sleep in the sewer for 7 nights, not tied or beaten, just sleep. Alone, no food, no fire. Just the sounds of dripping water, rats, and the occasional ghost story echoing off the walls. The man emerged on the 8th day speaking only in riddles. Senate minutes note, he was deemed unfit for logic, also smelly. You step outside now, back into fresh night air, grateful for every breeze. The stars seem sharper after the sewer's gloom. Above you, the Temple of Fortuna rises, goddess of luck. You wonder how many prayed to her while their feet slipped into sewage. Rome, for all its grandeur, never hesitated to use its foundations as punishment, sewer as sentence, waste as warning. You realize now that in a city built on symbolism, no place was too sacred or too filthy for justice. And as the cloaca hums quietly behind you, you can't help but think. Sometimes the most terrifying punishments don't roar, they trickle. You've left behind the rank echoes of Rome's sewer system, though the memory clings to your nostrils like a vengeful ghost. The cool night air feels redemptive now, even as it carries the faint smell of smoke, something sharp, acrid, and suspiciously celebratory. You follow the scent through narrow streets until you reach the charred remains of a tavern, its timbers still steaming. A crowd lingers, murmuring with a mix of awe and morbid interest. The culprit? Arson? The punishment? Well, that's where things get theatrical. In ancient Rome, setting fire to property wasn't just destruction, it was a cosmic offense. Flames didn't just consume, they insulted the gods, disrupted civic life, and made people miss lunch. So, the penalty had to be big, dramatic, preferably involving more fire. One popular sentence was the crematio supplicium, a forced fire dance in which the condemned was tied to a pole and placed near slow-burning coals. The idea wasn't to light them up immediately, but to make them shuffle, hape, and twitch while trying to escape the heat, like some ghastly version of interpretive dance. Spectators, of course, were encouraged to comment on form and footwork. Romans did love a good review. You edge closer to a guard who's recounting the case of Tiberius Crassus, a baker caught torching a rival's stall. His punishment? He was tied to a wheel turned slowly over flames, roasted like a poorly seasoned rotisserie, and then, according to rumor, force-fed undercooked lentils as a final insult. That part may not be verified, but it feels on brand. Historians still argue whether these slow-burn punishments were widely practiced or just threats designed to frighten would-be arsonists. But we do know Emperor Nero, yes, that Nero, was obsessed with fire, both as spectacle and symbol. Under his rule, convicted arsonists were reportedly covered in pitch and burned alive as living torches during garden parties. What's the Latin for red flag? Some suggest these torch punishments were part of Nero's larger theatrical style, where guilt or innocence mattered less than optics. One account even claims he made the accused wear stage costumes, because if you're going to punish someone horrifically, Apparently a sequin tunic makes it classier. You pass a shrine half burned, half intact. A boy is sweeping ash away from its base. He says nothing, but nods toward a placard nailed nearby. It lists names, victims and suspects from a warehouse fire 3 nights prior. The accused are expected to undergo a trial by fire, literally. They'll be made to carry red-hot iron rods across the forum. If they reach the other side without screaming, they're innocent. If they scream, well, oops. You linger near a fire pit now, watching a blacksmith reheat his tools. He mentions another punishment, less famous but deeply unsettling. For serial arsonists, he says, we use the ox hide. The what now? He explains. A person is sewn into a freshly skinned ox hide. Yes, it has to be fresh. And then left out in the sun. As the hide dries, it shrinks. You do the math. It's a punishment that doubles as performance art and internal organ origami. As grotesque as this sounds, Rome believes strongly in symbolic consequence. Fire represents chaos, destruction, impurity. The punishments for fire starting had to reflect that same wild, creeping terror. It wasn't just about punishing the person. It was about warning the crowd, chilling the next spark before it leapt. You drift toward a collapsed column still warm from a recent blaze. Nearby, 2 magistrates are discussing reforms. Perhaps more lashes, one suggests, or a public dunking in olive oil before branding. His colleague shrugs. The people like fire. You realize justice in Rome was often less about rehabilitation and more about crowd control. If they weren't entertained, were they really safe? But not every punishment burned skin. Some scorched reputations. A wealthy widow once accused of arson had her hair shaved and her property auctioned in the forum. The twist? She hadn't started the fire. It was her jealous neighbor. But Rome, like fire, doesn't always choose its targets carefully. One philosopher, whose name has slipped from history like embers on the wind, argued that fire is Rome's true god. We build with it, we kill with it, and we cleanse our streets by letting it speak. A bit dramatic, but then again, this is Rome. You look skyward. The stars flicker above like tiny torches. Somewhere, perhaps in a nearby alley, a conspirator holds a torch too tightly. Somewhere, another punishment is being devised, not with logic, but with kerosene and creativity. You settle beside a statue of Vulcan, god of fire and forge. Someone's placed a charred sandal at its base. A quiet offering or a warning. You're not sure which. But you feel the warmth of ancient flames licking at your thoughts as sleep begins to press gently at the edges of your mind. The smoke from the fires fades into the night behind you, but the scent clings faintly to your tunic as you make your way to the edge of the city, where the marble grandeur gives way to the grittier backstage of Roman entertainment. You're headed to the Colosseum's underbelly, a place where punishment wasn't just administered, it was staged, scored, and applauded. Down here, below the roaring crowd, punishment had a flair for the dramatic. The Romans called it damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. It was a sentence reserved for traitors, murderers, and sometimes unlucky playwrights. You find yourself walking along a corridor lined with barred cages. Inside, creatures pace. Lions, leopards, wolves, and even the occasional bear with what looks like professional stage fright. You pause beside a wooden crate. A grizzled beast handler is leaning on a spear, half asleep but willing to talk. Not all went quietly, he mutters. Some criminals just stood there, let the lions come. Others tried to run. Didn't matter. The crowd only cheered louder. He tells you of one woman, accused of poisoning her husband, who was dressed as a mythical figure, then chained to a pillar in the arena while panthers were released. The twist? She was fed grapes laced with opium before the show. Historians still argue whether this was mercy or showmanship. Rome preferred both. As you descend farther, past rusted chains and faded murals of heroic beasts, you reach the staging platform where prisoners awaited their moment. Some were disguised as characters from myths, Orpheus, Actaeon, Prometheus, so their deaths could double as theater. In this way, execution became morality play. Audiences clapped not just for blood, but for the symbolic justice dripping from it. But not everyone was meant to die. That's the secret whispered down here, the lore of the Colosseum's darker corners. Some condemned were meant to survive, or at least make it look like they did. One scroll recounts a thief sentenced to the beasts who instead emerged unscathed after the lion sniffed him once and lay down beside him. The crowd roared. A priest claimed divine intervention. The emperor called it underwhelming. The lion, probably just full. Sometimes the sentence wasn't death by beast, but cohabitation. In one bizarre case, a man was sentenced to spend the night in a cage with a wild dog. Not to be killed, just to think about his crimes while something drooled nearby. The goal wasn't execution, but emotional breakdown. Spoiler, it worked. You peer through a barred grate and see a faded inscription carved into the stone. Better the jaws than the judge. Poetic and deeply unsettling. One particularly odd tale involves a tax collector accused of skimming funds. His punishment? Being dressed in honey and staked in a pen with feral goats. Not deadly, but humiliating. The goats licked him for hours while the audience laughed. If the Romans had invented reality TV, this would have been their pilot episode. Another condemned man, accused of sorcery, was chained in a pen with a bear rumored to have prophetic powers. The man tried to argue with it. The bear growled. The crowd lost their minds. This punishment ended in death, but not the kind expected. He tripped, hit his head, and never woke up. The bear was promoted, probably. You wander toward a shallow pool in the arena floor, recently cleaned, but still red-tinted. In the early days, executions by beast included aquatic stunts. One punishment involved tying a person to a platform in the middle of the pool and releasing crocodiles. The platform would slowly lower into the water. If the criminal confessed before submersion, they were spared. If not, snack time. Some of these accounts are hard to verify. Historians debate whether the crocodiles were real or exaggerated, but the psychological torment of such punishments was entirely intentional. Rome didn't just kill, it designed experiences. There was also the tactic of audience participation. During festivals, citizens could vote on whether a condemned man should face the beasts or be spared. Sometimes the choice was influenced by bribes, other times by charisma. One man survived because he made the crowd laugh by impersonating a senator. Another died because he tripped on his way in and lost the audience. Timing, as always, is everything. You sit now in the cool dust of the arena floor, imagining the roars, the drums, the moment the gates opened. The fear, the scent of animal breath, the laughter above, it all blended into Rome's unique vision of justice. You weren't just punished, you were part of a story. And as the moon rises over the broken arches, you feel it settle over your body like a warm blanket of absurdity. Rome, after all, didn't just punish, it performed, and sometimes the performance was worse than the pain. The taste of dust and beast-laced air still clings to your mouth as you rise from the Colosseum's arena floor. You brush yourself off, figuratively, since this is a bedtime story, and begin wandering toward the quieter, more cerebral heart of Roman justice, the law of the 12 tables. Now, before you drift off entirely, don't worry. We're not diving into dry legal scrolls here. These weren't your average thou shalt nots. No, the 12 tables were like a Pinterest board for punishments, charmingly archaic, weirdly specific, and alarmingly focused on goats. Passed in the 5th century B.C.E., these were Rome's first attempt at written law. They were engraved in bronze tablets and displayed publicly, mostly to prevent patricians from gaslighting the plebeians. No one told me I couldn't throw my neighbor into a well. Yes, Lucius, it's right there, table 8, line 4. You stroll into the forum, where a replica of the tablet stands, chipped and solemn. A magistrate sits nearby with a scroll and a half-eaten fig. He offers you a sleepy smirk. Want to hear about toe-touching? He asks. Apparently, under one interpretation, if someone stepped on your land or so much as touched the corner of your property, yes, even with a big toe, you could drag them to court. The punishment? A fine. Or, if you couldn't pay, a day labor sentence involving manure relocation. We called it the humble shuffle, he adds with a yawn. But the laws got weirder. Table 3, for example, dictated that a debtor who couldn't pay had 30 days to resolve it. After that, the creditor could legally chop the debtor up and divide the parts with other lenders. Historians still argue whether anyone ever actually got dismembered, the magistrate admits, but the legal right was technically there. Very motivational. You wander past a carved relief showing a cow trampling a vine. Turns out, damaging another man's crops, even by accident, was a big no-no. You could be fined or publicly shamed. In one case, a farmer was forced to wear a wreath made of trampled cabbage and walk through the marketplace mooing. Again, this may not be 100% verified, but the cabbage wreath definitely sounds Roman. Some laws were designed with terrifying specificity. One clause from Table 8 mentions that if someone sings a slanderous song about another person, especially a patrician, the punishment could be death by clubbing. It's unclear whether this led to a reduction in musical theater, but it certainly raised the stakes for Roman karaoke night. Another clause addressed firewood theft. If you were caught sneaking timber off someone's land by night, you'd be whipped or branded. If by day, just fined. Apparently, the law considered nighttime lumber thieves morally sketchier, possibly because they also stole snacks. You notice a child playing nearby with a wooden tablet, mimicking a court trial. His defendant is a doll missing an arm. He sentences it to exile, possibly harsh, but legally consistent. Then there's the Table 7 classic. If a tree's branches extend into your property, you may cut them up to 15 feet high. Beyond that, you must appeal to the local arbiter. You imagine two stern Romans arguing under a fig tree while scribes measure upward with a stylus and ladder. Because bureaucracy must be thorough, even when it involves leaves. You sit beside a fountain shaped like a lion's head. A passing scholar in dusty robes tells you about lex talionis, the law of retaliation. Eye for an eye wasn't always literal, but under certain tables, physical harm could be paid for with equal injury. One butcher, after injuring a rival's nose in a tavern scuffle, was ordered to have his own nose gently broken. The method? A trained goat. Don't ask. Some laws were clearly more symbolic than practical. Table 10, for instance, banned excessive funeral displays. Mourning with too many flute players or weepy relatives could incur a fine. Yes, grief was taxable. Too dramatic at Grandpa's funeral? That'll be 2 denarii. You glance at a mosaic nearby, a judge seated, a litigant pointing at a pig, and a crowd laughing. The pig, it turns out, had eaten the neighbor's sacred garum stash. The pig was found guilty. The punishment? Forced pilgrimage to a distant farm. Emotional damage was paid in barley. Rome's laws reveal a society obsessed with balance. Every right had a matching obligation. Every punishment, a dose of theatricality. You couldn't just resolve disputes, you had to perform justice. And as you rest now near the edge of the forum, lulled by the rhythmic splash of the fountain and the far-off arguments of 2 toga wearers over parking space for chariots, you realize that the 12 tables weren't just legal documents. They were stories. Stories etched in bronze, full of fear, fairness, and deeply questionable fashion choices. In Rome, even the laws wore costumes. You stretch, the whisper of old Latin still humming in your ears like a lullaby filtered through bureaucracy. The forum quiets behind you as you drift toward one of Rome's most enduring obsessions: poison. Not dramatic like the Colosseum, not righteous like the Senate. No, poison was subtle, whispered, and often slipped into lentils. Welcome to the darker, slipperier side of Roman punishment. You wander through a residential district now, where every villa has secrets and every cup of wine could be someone's last toast. Rome had laws about poison, but more importantly, it had paranoia about poison. Accusations flew faster than daggers, and the punishments, let's just say they weren't exactly evidence-based. In one infamous case, a housewife named Licinia was accused of poisoning her husband's stew. She insisted it was just under-seasoned. The judge wasn't buying it. Her sentence? She had to eat her own leftover meal in court. If she survived, she was innocent. If not, well, that would be very awkward testimony. Historians still argue whether these eat-your-evidence trials were regular practice or local superstitions. One scroll even describes a senator who forced a suspect to drink from 10 goblets, 9 of which were harmless. The 10th, salted vinegar and goat spit. He didn't die, but he definitely developed trust issues. You arrive now at the Temple of Juno, where women once gathered to bless their homes and banish evil spirits, also a hotspot for gossip. Poison was often considered a woman's crime in Rome, especially when men couldn't explain how they suddenly got sick after insulting their wives. There was a brief period in 331 BCE when over 170 women were tried for poisoning in a mass hysteria wave. Most were executed, no evidence needed, just vibes. Rome even had a professional poison hunter, the Questor Venenorum, whose job was to investigate suspicious deaths. If your neighbor's goats dropped dead mysteriously, you could file a formal complaint. And yes, there were punishments for poisoners of livestock, ranging from branding to forced public apology. Delivered in goat costume. Allegedly. You stop beside a fresco in an alley, barely visible. It shows a magistrate arguing with a weasel. Seems ridiculous, right? But weasels were sacred to some Roman households, seen as omens, protectors, or suspiciously intelligent furballs. One court case revolved around a pet ferret accused of transmitting poison by dragging tainted herbs into a soup pot. The verdict? The ferret was acquitted, the cook was fined, and the herb seller exiled to Corsica. Then there's the famous case of Lucius Calpurnius Bestia, who claimed his ulcers were caused by poison. When physicians disagreed, he blamed his slave, then his wife, then a passing mime. Eventually, he was found guilty of wasting court resources and sentenced to serve on latrine duty for a month. a punishment that cured him of all ulcers and most of his social invitations. But the most iconic poison trial of all? The story of Opianica, who married, murdered, remarried, and repeated until his stepson had him convicted. Opianica's punishment wasn't immediate death. Oh no. He was slowly paraded through multiple towns, forced to give anti-poison lectures to children. Imagine a serial killer giving TED Talks to toddlers. That was Rome's idea of reformation. You move now past a vendor selling dried figs, an innocent treat unless you're familiar with the case of Senator Plautus, who used a poisoned fig to dispatch his political rival. Caught in the act by a curious crow, he was sentenced not to death, but to be mocked in public by wearing a fig costume and handing out fruit samples labeled "totally safe." Justice served with a side of shade. In another district, the baths echo with tales of herbal sabotage. Bathhouse servants were often scapegoats for mysterious illnesses. One servant, accused of rubbing belladonna on the emperor's towel, was boiled in the very bath he'd tended. Harsh. But worse, he turned out to be innocent. So, the bathhouse owner was fined, and his punishment. He had to bathe with senators for a year, which, by all accounts, was worse than death. You begin to see the pattern. In Rome, poison was feared not just because it killed, but because it was invisible. It shattered the illusion of control, so punishments had to be public, theatrical, and a little ridiculous. Because fear needs drama to feel real. You pause at a garden now, overgrown but fragrant. Beneath a flowering laurel, a plaque reads, "Here lies the woman who didn't poison anyone, but no one believed her." A quiet reminder that in Rome, innocence was a complicated flavor. As the night deepens and the scent of old herbs and fermented fear fades, you nestle beneath the shadow of the laurel. The city hums on, whispering recipes, rumors, and warnings into the wind. And you sleep, hopefully with your drink well out of reach. You stir beneath the laurel tree, the scent of ancient paranoia still clinging to your senses. As you rise, the sounds of soldiers marching reach your ears, steady, rhythmic, too coordinated for civilians. You follow the echoing boots down a long, dusty road that leads away from the city center and toward the military camps on Rome's fringes. This is where discipline wasn't just valued, it was weaponized. Tonight, you're about to witness one of the most brutal and mathematically twisted punishments Rome ever devised: decimation. Decimation wasn't symbolic, it wasn't poetic, it was arithmetic vengeance. When a legion disobeyed orders, whether by mutiny, cowardice, or simply bad timing, the punishment was as follows. The soldiers were divided into groups of 10. Each group then drew lots. One unlucky man in each group would be selected, and the remaining 9 were ordered to beat him to death. Yes, by his own comrades. You stand now in the training yard of a weathered camp, the ground grooved with years of drills and punishment. A centurion is recounting a tale of a legion in Gaul that fled battle too early. "Cowards," he mutters, "so we lined them up. 1 in 10 fell. The rest stood straighter afterward," which is a poetic way of saying trauma builds posture. Historians still argue whether decimation was truly common or just a deterrent whispered around campfires to keep discipline in line. But we have documented cases. Crassus used it in 71 BCE after his troops lost to Spartacus's rebels. Because nothing says, "I forgive you," like a blood lottery. You notice a faded mural in the barracks depicting Mars, the god of war, holding a die in one hand and a severed sandal in the other. The caption, "Fortune favors the numerically lucky." As the camp winds down for the night, Another soldier leans over a barrel and tells you about less terminal punishments. Sleeping on watch, that earned a flogging or time in the fossa, a pit filled with water and waste where you had to stand all night. Talking back to a superior could get you bound to a stake during battle, not to fight, just to watch. It changes your perspective, the soldier says, sipping wine, especially when you're watching your mates get hit with arrows. Then there was the classic, running the gauntlet. A condemned soldier had to jog between two rows of his comrades, each armed with sticks. If he made it through alive, he was forgiven. If not, well, there was usually a medic. One soldier, infamous for stealing extra rations, ran the gauntlet wearing only his sandals and a smile. He survived. The punishment? He was nicknamed Cupid forever after. The name stuck. The rations did not. But punishment wasn't just physical, it could be psychological. Disgraced centurions were made to wear civilian robes and march at the rear of the formation, sometimes holding signs that read, "I failed Rome." Others were assigned to latrine duty for a month while reciting military creeds backwards. Imagine scrubbing toilets while chanting, "Victory brings discipline," in reverse. You pass the smithy now, where broken swords are melted down into plowshares or punishment tokens. A quiet rumor circulates about soldiers who betrayed their oath being forced to forge their own chains before exile. If the chain broke in transport, the soldier was executed. If not, they got to live out their days shackled and cultivating olives. Honestly, one guard admits, the olives were great. One scroll details a particularly theatrical punishment. A cohort caught gambling on duty was forced to wear women's tunics and parade through a captured town while singing love songs. It was humiliating and oddly catchy. The tune allegedly became popular in Gaul for months afterward. Rome, exporting culture, whether you want it or not. And then there's the infamous feather helmet sentence. Soldiers who spoke during meditation drills were made to wear a helmet covered in brightly colored feathers and march in front of the formation, shouting, "I am a peacock and I know nothing." It didn't hurt, but it stuck in your career like a cursed tattoo. You find a quiet tent now, the canvas flapping gently in the night breeze. Inside, a commander is writing disciplinary reports by lamplight. He looks tired, not cruel, just exhausted by the need to maintain order in a world where chaos loomed at every border. Rome's military wasn't just about conquest, it was about conformity. The punishments weren't always fatal, but they were always deliberate, designed to break pride, to shame failure, and, ironically, to forge unity through fear. As you lie beneath the stars, the echoes of marching feet fade into a distant lullaby. You realize decimation wasn't just about killing. It was about control, not of the enemy, but of your own. And sleep creeps in now, quiet as a scout, ready to pull your blanket tighter and whisper, "At least you're not wearing the feather helmet." The stars shift lazily above the Roman camp as you rise, the ghost of decimation still hovering somewhere behind your eyelids. You follow a quiet road back toward the marble heart of the empire, where torches flicker against polished stone and egos loom larger than statues. Here, power isn't worn on a uniform, it's shaved into a chin strap. Tonight, you've wandered into the odd, almost theatrical world of crimes against the emperor's ego. You might expect that treason in Rome involved grand betrayals, poison plots, or dagger-wielding senators. And yes, those did happen. But in the empire's later years, especially under volatile emperors like Caligula, Nero, and Domitian, your crime could be as small as a sneeze at the wrong time. Or, more alarmingly, coughing during a royal speech. You overhear a palace servant whispering about a man who once cleared his throat too loudly while Caligula passed by. The result? Public shaming and exile to a particularly windy cliff in Sicily. No trial, no defense. Just a one-way boat ticket and some light emotional baggage. You find yourself near the Domus Aurea, Nero's golden house. It gleams faintly under the moon, all gold leaf and bad decisions. Here, image was everything, and punishments were curated like art. One man was punished for comparing Nero's singing voice to a donkey's bray. His sentence? He had to dress as a donkey for a month and deliver scrolls around Rome, slowly, while braying. Historians still argue whether this incident really happened or was a form of ancient satire. But given what we know about Nero's ego, he made senators attend his full-length lyre recitals in total silence. It's entirely plausible. You wander deeper into the imperial gardens, past sculpted hedges trimmed to resemble the emperor's profile. You hear laughter, nervous, brittle, as courtiers recount the punishment of a noblewoman who rolled her eyes during a recitation of Domitian's poetry. Her sentence? All her statues were defaced and her home renamed the House of Uninspired Women. Brutal. Also, surprisingly on brand. Another tale floats past your ears. A cook once served lukewarm peacock to Commodus. The emperor was so offended, he ordered the man to be painted gold and paraded through the streets with a sign that read, "I serve mediocrity." A weird punishment, yes, but also an early Yelp review system. There was even a documented case of a senator punished for wearing more purple than the emperor on a feast day. Purple was the imperial color, after all. This senator's fate? He was sentenced to wear only beige for the rest of his life. That's not a metaphor. That's wardrobe fascism. Some emperors weaponize flattery into a trap. Under Tiberius, anyone who praised the emperor too much was suspected of sarcasm, a high crime. One poor soul wrote a poem comparing Tiberius to Jupiter. He was accused of mockery and sentenced to a year of silence. How strictly this was enforced is unclear, but one historian notes that the man was later caught mouthing words to a bird. The bird was confiscated. Justice. You pause now beside a reflecting pool where a bust of Emperor Hadrian gazes moodily into the water. A nearby tutor tells the story of an artist punished for sculpting Hadrian with a slightly crooked nose. His sentence? He had to carve 100 identical busts, each nose straighter than the last. One by one, he lost his will to chisel. But the noses? Chef's kiss. Perhaps the strangest punishment of all involved a man who criticized the emperor's beard during a bathhouse visit. He didn't know the emperor was in the next room. The guards dragged him out, shaved him bald, and assigned him to beard patrol duty, a team responsible for complimenting the emperor's facial hair each morning. Your curls shine like Jupiter's thunderbolt. Every day, for a year. Rome was many things, but subtle, not so much. And yet, for every absurd tale of ego-driven vengeance, there was also quiet fear. People learned to speak in riddles, to couch opinions in parables, to express enthusiasm with just the right number of claps. One man was executed for clapping too late after a speech, another for clapping too early. Timing, again, was everything. You lie now beside the cool marble edge of a courtyard, the whisper of wind brushing against stone. The empire around you is powerful, glorious, and deeply insecure. You begin to understand that in Rome, the most fragile thing was not a vase or a peace treaty. It was the emperor's self-esteem. And so, people were punished not just for crimes, but for discomfort, for reminders that even gods in human form could be mocked. In a city where a single raised eyebrow could get you reassigned to goat washing duty in Gaul, the safest expression was no expression at all. You close your eyes, hoping your dreams are perfectly respectful, appropriately impressed, and absolutely silent. You awaken beneath the marble gaze of Hadrian's moody bust, the memory of imperial insecurities still tickling the corners of your mind. But tonight, your journey moves from palaces and paranoia to a quieter, but no less dangerous corner of Roman society, the world of philosophers. Yes, the toga-wrapped thinkers, the chin-stroking speech-makers, the ancient equivalent of that guy at a party who insists on quoting Aristotle. These intellectuals weren't just harmless babblers about virtue and metaphysics. In Rome, thinking too hard could get you whipped, especially if you dared think out loud. You stroll now through the portico of Octavia, once a bustling hub of discussion, debate, and occasionally disciplined flogging. You pass a circle of statues, Socrates, Zeno, Cicero, all looking either enlightened or like they just lost a very frustrating argument. Under the Republic, philosophers were tolerated, even admired. But during the Empire, that admiration was often conditional, especially when your philosophical ponderings began questioning the emperor's morals, tax policies, or favorite goat statue. One Stoic, Arulinus Rusticus, wrote a flattering tribute to Thrasea Paetus, an executed senator. The punishment? Rusticus was burned alive, along with all known copies of his work, because nothing says "don't think for yourself" like a public book barbecue. You duck into a nearby atrium where a scribe recounts the tale of a cynic who disrupted a festival by shouting, "All is vanity," from a rooftop. He was sentenced to a week of silent meals served by mimes. Apparently, the sensory deprivation was unsettling enough to shut him up for life. Historians still argue whether these punishments were truly about philosophy or simply about control of speech. After all, when ideas spread faster than plague, emperors got nervous. Even Seneca, the famed tutor of Nero, was eventually forced to commit suicide. His crime? Being near a conspiracy. Or maybe just looking too smug one day. It's unclear. You wander toward a modest lecture hall where a bust of Epictetus presides over an empty stone bench. Epictetus himself was once a slave, then a freedman, and eventually a philosopher of great influence. His ideas focused on endurance, serenity, and not complaining when life or the emperor stomped on your dignity. Naturally, Rome viewed this stoicism with a mixture of admiration and deep suspicion. One record tells of a group of young students flogged for distributing handwritten Stoic quotes around the city. The quotes, harmless things like, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." Their punishment? A week of hauling amphorae full of rainwater up the Palatine Hill. Every time they spilled a drop, they had to recite an apology, in dactylic hexameter. Even Epicureans weren't safe. Their philosophy of pleasure and simple living was seen as too countercultural. One group was fined for holding a symposium where no wine was served. Yes, that was considered suspicious behavior in Rome. You pass a small shrine where someone has left an offering of olives and a scroll. The scrolls open to a passage from Marcus Aurelius, ironically, an emperor who was a philosopher. But even he banished certain thinkers for spreading what he considered divisive ideas. Apparently, being chill with pain doesn't mean being chill with public dissent. You overhear a tutor telling his pupil, "Speak truth, but not in crowds." He recounts how one philosopher, Julius Gracchus, was executed simply for having too noble a character. Imagine dying for your vibe. Rome could be petty. And then there's the peculiar punishment of the wheel of rhetoric. One philosopher caught lecturing without a permit, yes, that was a thing, was tied to a large wooden wheel in the forum and forced to answer heckled questions shouted by passers-by. Every wrong answer earned a slow spin. Eventually, the crowd got bored and wandered off, leaving him gently rotating for hours. He later claimed it was his most enlightening dialogue. Mixed reviews. You stop by a faded mural showing a philosopher with a fish tied to his belt. According to legend, he was sentenced to wear it for a week after insulting a tax collector's logic. The fish represented foolishness, or maybe just an overstocked market that day. Either way, his career never recovered. Yet, despite the risk, the thinkers kept thinking. Rome needed them. Even as it punished them, it couldn't quite let them go. Philosophy was both a threat and a mirror, a reminder that even emperors are subject to the same cosmic rules. Sort of. As you settle now beside a cracked marble column, the silence of the Philosophers' Forum wraps around you like an old, slightly dusty blanket. Here, the punishments weren't loud or bloody. They were clever, subtle, occasionally fish-scented, and you begin to drift, pondering whether your own thoughts tonight might get you fined in ancient Rome, or worse, assigned mime duty. You drift from the stoic echoes of whispered philosophy into a part of Rome that breathes differently. It's busier here, denser. The alleys are narrower, the footsteps heavier. You're walking into the world of those with no legal status, no citizenship, no toga privileges. You're walking into the world of slaves. And in Rome, if there was one group that experienced punishment not as spectacle, but as daily policy, it was the enslaved. You find yourself outside a domus, a wealthy house where the scent of roast meat and incense swirl in the air. Inside, a slave accidentally drops a silver tray. The silence that follows is louder than a trumpet. The master, eyes narrowed, raises a hand, not to strike, but to summon the villicus, the slave overseer. The punishment, immediate and performative. The tray dropper is sentenced to wear an iron collar that reads, "I ruined dinner." He'll wear it for a week. Light by Roman standards, but deeply humiliating. That's the thing with slave punishments in Rome. They weren't just about control. They were about reminders. Reminders of power, of hierarchy, of Rome's casual cruelty wrapped in civility. You walk through the back alley of the estate, where laundry flaps and punishments fester. A man chained to a post is humming softly. His crime? Oversleeping. His sentence? A day bound in place while birds investigate his hair. He hums anyway. Then you hear it. A whispered tale passed among kitchen staff. A Roman noble was murdered in his sleep. His entire household of 400 slaves was executed, every last one. Men, women, children. Their crime? Proximity. The law, under Emperor Augustus, held slaves collectively responsible for their master's safety. So, when the noble died, stabbed, they say, by one, Rome didn't investigate. Rome retaliated. Historians still argue whether that execution truly included every person, or whether some were sold off discreetly. But what's not debated is this. The message was clear. Slaves were to be not just obedient, but alert. Eternally. Exhaustingly. You pause beside a slave market where collars and branding irons are laid out like jewelry. One bronze tag reads, "Hold me. I am a runaway. Return for reward." Some collars had instructions, others had prayers. None had dignity. Branding was common, the forehead, the shoulder, even the tongue. Slaves who tried to escape were branded with an F for fugitivus, runaway. One man, caught 3 times, had the phrase, "I love to run," carved into his arm. Ironically, he later became a famous runner in a Saturnalia race. Romans love their irony. You pass a bakery where a slave is being punished for stealing flour, not executed, just force-fed bread until he vomits. One guard chuckles, "Let him choke on the thing he desired," which is exactly the kind of lesson ancient Rome found morally nutritious. Some punishments were bizarrely creative. One scroll tells of a slave who insulted his mistress's hair. His punishment? He was shaved bald and forced to wear her discarded wigs backward for a month. Call it comedy, call it cruelty. It's Rome. You reach a household temple now, where a quiet ceremony is taking place. A slave stands nearby, hands trembling as a priest blesses a new statue. You overhear the whispered threat. Drop this, and the gods won't be the only ones punishing you. The implication? Flogging, or worse, crucifixion. Not always for rebellion, sometimes just for bad timing. Crucifixion, though brutal, was commonly reserved for slaves. It wasn't about the crime, it was about visibility. A message nailed to wood. Some were crucified on the road into the city, like grim welcome signs. One escaped slave, when caught, was crucified upside down with a scroll pinned to his chest. So others may read why silence is safer. And yet, not all slave punishments were about pain. Some were about transformation. A particularly disobedient slave, instead of being whipped, was rewarded with freedom, but only to be re-enslaved by the same household under harsher terms. Rome didn't just punish the body, it punished the illusion of hope. You sit now near a field where freedmen harvest grain. A former slave speaks as he sharpens a sickle. "I've had worse punishments," he says, but the worst was pretending the whip didn't hurt. In Rome, slaves were everywhere. In the kitchens, the libraries, the streets, the temples. They were the city's engine. And punishment? That was the oil, cruel, constant, carefully measured. As you lie down in the tall grass, staring at stars slaves rarely looked up to, you feel the weight of their silence, their unrecorded stories, their unremarked agony. Their lives shaped Rome, and their suffering shaped its law. And as sleep brushes gently against your eyes, you murmur a quiet hope that somewhere, someone remembered their names. You wake with a start, your breath catching on a sound you didn't expect. Laughter, not the light, wine-fueled chuckle of a Roman feast, but something stranger, wheezier, more caprine. You follow the odd noise down a side path away from the fields and into a clearing framed by broken columns and overgrown vines. And there, carved into a fading slab of stone, is a depiction so ridiculous you almost laugh too. A man tied to a bench, his feet coated in something sticky, while a goat dutifully licks them. Yes, tonight you've arrived at one of the strangest corners of Roman punishment. The goat lick torture. It sounds made up. It should be made up. But the Romans, in their infinite flair for combining cruelty with innovation, truly experimented with using goats as instruments of pain. The setup was simple. A man accused of theft, betrayal, or just annoying someone powerful enough would be bound with his feet exposed. Then, those feet would be slathered in salt or honey, or, in some delightfully odd cases, fish sauce. A goat, or multiple goats, would then be brought in, and they'd do what goats do best, lick. At first, it was almost pleasant, ticklish, absurd, humiliating. But the goat's tongue, rough as sandpaper and persistent as gossip, would eventually begin to abrade the skin. Slowly, painfully. No blood, just discomfort escalating into agony, then injury. It was torture by escalation, and laughter. Historians still argue how common this was. Some suggest it was used more for spectacle than punishment, like a half-serious sentence given to lower offenders. Others believe it was real and effective, particularly for those whose crime was being a little too smug. You sit now on a mossy bench nearby, imagining the trial, a magistrate trying not to smirk, a defendant insisting they were innocent, a goat handler in the corner, already opening a salt pouch. Justice, Roman style. There's a documented case from the reign of Tiberius in which a man, accused of mocking the emperor's voice, was sentenced to the goat bench. The records note, he endured it poorly, yet confessed before the third bleat. Which raises questions. Did the goat bleat, or did the man? Was there a timekeeper? These details are tragically lost. You walk now to a nearby wall where graffiti shows a crude drawing of a man with goat prints around his feet and the words, "He squealed first." Rome had no chill. Even its jokes were historical records. But goat licking wasn't the only animal-adjacent punishment. You overhear a guard talking about the mouse jar, another form of psychological torture. The accused would be tied, and a small jar with a live rodent placed against their skin. Then, heat would be applied to the back of the jar, forcing the terrified mouse to attempt an escape through flesh. Not common, not confirmed, but certainly whispered around campfires as a cautionary tale. Rome didn't just punish with weapons, it punished with nature. Bees, snakes, scorpions. One provincial governor once sentenced a tax cheat to sleep in a room filled with biting ants. The man survived. He never cheated again. He also never wore sandals. And then there was the donkey treadmill, not as violent, but undeniably humiliating. Certain minor offenders were sentenced to walk endlessly on a circular treadmill beside donkeys, while dressed as donkeys. Occasionally, they'd be tasked with braying or carrying baskets of fruit on their heads. The idea? Make them feel the absurdity of their crime, or just make them ridiculous until the crowd forgave them. You pass a statue now of Pan, the goat-legged god of mischief. Someone has scratched a line into its base. Justice bleats. Beneath it, another hand is added, but mercy bites. Romans. Always editing each other's graffiti. The goat-lick torture was strange. It was embarrassing. It was Roman in its absolute dedication to theatrical absurdity. But, like many punishments, it also reflected a culture obsessed with control through humiliation. Pain wasn't always about blood. It could be about losing your dignity slowly, lick by deliberate lick. You lie back on a patch of grass, moonlight flickering through the trees. Somewhere nearby, you hear an actual goat bleat. Just once. As if history's still out there, quietly judging you. Or maybe just looking for salt. And as sleep begins to wrap around your ankles like soft wool, you marvel at the sheer creativity of Roman justice. Not content with swords and chains, they looked at goats and asked, "What if?" And honestly, they answered that question far too thoroughly. You awake to silence, not the quiet of peace, but that eerie, loaded hush Rome sometimes wore, when it had just done something questionable. The sky is a dull indigo, stars fading, city sounds still sleeping. You rise slowly and find yourself wandering toward the edge of the Tiber River, where fog licks the shoreline, like some ancient secret trying to escape. This morning, you're heading into the most uncertain corner of Roman justice. Punishment so bizarre, so unsettling, that even historians still don't agree if they ever truly happened. But Rome was a city of extremes. If it could be imagined, someone probably tried it. Take the story of the zoo sack, for instance. You've heard whispers before. The poena culae, the punishment for parricide. A person convicted of killing their own father or parent wasn't just executed. They were sewn into a sack alongside a dog, a monkey, a rooster, and a snake, and then thrown into the river. The logic? No one's quite sure. Each animal likely had symbolic meaning: betrayal, rage, cowardice, chaos. Or maybe it was just what was available at the market that day. Scholars still debate whether all 4 animals were always included, or if that was a particularly dramatic variant reserved for high-profile cases. You pass a marble plaque inscribed with what might be a sentence from a legal record. "He died among beasts, for he acted worse than one." If this really happened, and the sources are murky, it tells you everything about Rome's approach to moral boundaries. Cross them, and Rome wouldn't just punish you. It would stage an allegory with livestock. Further down the path, you come across a disused execution platform. A guide, half asleep on a bench nearby, offers you one last tale: the man into animal punishment. Supposedly, in some provinces, traitors were sewn into the hides of recently slaughtered animals, oxen, lions, even donkeys, and left to rot in the sun. The skin would shrink, suffocating the wearer. Whether the victim died of heat, panic, or humiliation was academic. Again, historians clash over this one. Some call it myth. Others point to literary references and inscriptions. One mentions a certain tribune who dared mock the emperor's mother and was reborn in the skin of her mule. Poetic? Horrifying? Yes. You wander now toward a mosaic depicting men in animal suits, part of a festival, perhaps. But could it also be a memory of this punishment, sanitized over time? Rome loved blurring lines, fact and fable, justice and theater. There's also the infamous rumor, whispered by exiles and recorded grudgingly by scribes, that a few high-ranking traitors were given a final choice: death by sword or death by laughter. This allegedly involved being tickled endlessly by feathers or soft brushes until collapse. One victim supposedly laughed himself unconscious, after which he was carried to the sea and dropped off a cliff. Was it real? Probably not. But Rome wanted people to believe it was. A senator once proposed that liars should be punished by repeating their falsehood under truth serum, a mix of wine, opium, and bee venom. He was never taken seriously, probably because he also suggested tax breaks for poets. Then there's the permanent sleep chamber, a niche tale, rarely confirmed, but mentioned in 2 sources. A traitor was locked in a room designed to induce eternal sleep. Sweet-smelling oils, soft music, endless darkness, a luxurious tomb. He didn't die from violence, just never woke up. Some call it the kindest Roman punishment. Others say it was invented by an author trying to sound edgy. You rest now at the riverbank, the Tiber murmuring beside you like a co-conspirator. Rome's strangest punishments were often metaphors. They weren't always real, but they felt real enough to shape behavior, to whisper caution, to sculpt fear into obedience. Whether sewn into sacks or paraded in feathers, Romans knew that justice wasn't always about evidence. It was about effect. And the more absurd the sentence, the more memorable the warning. So, here, at the edge of this ancient absurdity, you lie back, letting the world blur around the edges. You think about sacks and goats and scholarly debates that span centuries, and you smile, because tonight you have wandered through the wildest punishments history may or may not have ever known. And whether they were real, that's not the point. Rome believed them, and that was enough. And now, as the last flickers of torches die down, and the first bird dares to chirp in defiance of the night, you feel yourself sinking, deeper into your pillow, deeper into silence. The kind of stillness only the ancient world can give. A soft, heavy hush woven from stone, sweat, and a million forgotten sighs. The chaos of Rome fades, the absurdity dissolves, and all that remains is this curious calm. You are no longer trailing punishments or brushing past iron collars. You're simply here, safe, drowsy, unpunished. Let your breath slow. Inhale something cooler, lighter. No torches, no goat tongues. Just the soft hum of the fan, the pull of gravity urging your limbs to settle. Your body knows the journey's over. The verdict is in. You've survived. Somewhere far away, a senator snores. A scroll gathers dust, and a particularly sleepy philosopher mumbles stoic wisdom into his toga. But you don't need epigrams or eulogies. You need sleep. So let go of the bronze tablets. Release the animal skins and courtroom dramas. Let them float into the fog over the Tiber, where they can rest with all the other strange, shimmering fragments of history. You've walked through a city that punished imagination and elevated absurdity, and now it rewards you with peace. Close your eyes, friend. You've served your sentence. End of script. Sweet dreams.